Hey folks, tonight we begin with something a little more dangerous than our previous adventures. We're diving into what it was really like to be a Wild West sheriff. You know, those heroes from the movies, the brave lawmen who kept order with nothing but a badge and a six-shooter. The reality? Being a sheriff in the Wild West was basically volunteering for an early grave while being paid in peanuts and hatred. So, before you settle in with your coffee and imagine yourself as the next Wyatt Earp, take a moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and whether you think you'd have the courage to pin on a badge in 1870s Kansas. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on some ambient Western sounds, and let's ride into tonight's journey together. Fair warning though, by the end of this, you'll never look at Western movies the same way again. The badge wasn't a symbol of heroism, it was a target painted on your back. Congratulations, you've just been elected Sheriff of Dodge City, Kansas in 1873. The good news, you're now the most important person in town. The bad news, you're also the most likely person to be murdered before Christmas, and it's only September. Let's start with how you got this job, because it sure wasn't through a rigorous application process and background check. Most frontier sheriffs fell into the position through one of several equally problematic routes. Maybe you were the only person brave enough, stupid enough, or drunk enough to accept the job when the previous sheriff got himself killed. Maybe you were elected by townspeople who figured anyone was better than nobody, even if that anyone was a former saloon bouncer with a drinking problem and questionable aim. Or perhaps you were appointed by a territorial government that had never set foot in your town and had no idea that appointing you sheriff was essentially signing your death warrant. The territorial authorities back east had a charming habit of treating sheriff appointments like they were handing out post office jobs, completely oblivious to the fact that your post office came with daily shootouts and a life expectancy shorter than a mayfly is. The qualification requirements were refreshingly simple. You needed to be able to hold a gun without dropping it, and preferably without shooting yourself in the foot. Previous law enforcement experience was nice but not necessary. The ability to read and write was considered a bonus but not essential. Being sober during business hours was aspirational rather than mandatory. What you really needed was a combination of courage, stupidity, and desperation in roughly equal proportions. Courage to face down armed criminals who outnumbered you 50-1. Stupidity to think this was a good idea in the first place. And desperation because, honestly, what sane person would take this job unless they were completely out of other options? The badge itself was often literally a target. Many frontier towns couldn't afford proper sheriff's badges, so they'd make do with whatever metal could be stamped with sheriff and pinned to your shirt. Some badges were made from silver dollars, which sounds impressive until you realize that wearing precious metal on your chest in a town full of desperate people was like painting a bullseye on yourself. Other badges were made from tin, which had the advantage of being cheap, but the disadvantage of looking exactly as authoritative as you'd expect a tin badge to look. The ceremony of becoming sheriff was usually about as formal as ordering a drink at the local saloon. Someone would hand you the badge, maybe shake your hand, and wish you luck. If you were fortunate, the previous sheriff was still alive to give you advice. If you were less fortunate, they'd hand you the badge along with a list of people who had killed the last 3 sheriffs and were probably planning to kill you too. Your first day on the job typically began with someone explaining the local rules of engagement, which usually boiled down to shoot first, ask questions later, and try not to hit any paying customers. You'd be introduced to your office, which might be anything from a proper jail building to a tent with bars painted on it. Your staff consisted of whatever deputies were still alive and still willing to work with you, which could be anywhere from 0 to maybe 2 people, depending on how recently someone had gotten shot. The mortality statistics for frontier sheriffs were sobering when you bothered to look at them, which most people didn't because it was bad for recruitment. In some frontier towns, the average tenure of a sheriff was measured in weeks rather than years. Dodge City went through 16 sheriffs in its first decade. Some resigned, some moved on to other opportunities, but a disturbing number died violently in the course of their duties. The life insurance industry, such as it was, refused to write policies for frontier sheriffs. Banks wouldn't give them loans for houses because the banks figured there was a good chance the sheriff wouldn't live long enough to pay them back. Even undertakers gave sheriffs discounts on caskets, partly out of professional courtesy and partly because they knew they'd be seeing a lot of their business. But hey, at least you got a badge and the respect of the community, right? Well, about that respect, let's talk about the compensation package for being a frontier sheriff, because it's important to understand exactly how little you were being paid to risk your life every single day. The financial arrangements were usually so bad that you'd be better off economically by just about any other job, including digging ditches or mucking out horse stalls. Most frontier sheriffs were paid through a combination of salary, fees, and what can charitably be called creative revenue generation. The salary portion was usually anywhere from $30 to $50 per month, which sounds reasonable until you consider that a decent hotel room cost $2 a night and a good meal cost 50 cents. You were essentially being paid enough to afford basic survival, assuming you didn't die and therefore didn't need to survive. But the real money, such as it was, came from fees. Sheriffs could charge fees for serving warrants, making arrests, transporting prisoners, and various other services. This fee-for-service model created some interesting incentives. You made more money if there were more crimes to solve and more criminals to arrest. This was supposed to motivate you to be an effective law enforcement officer, but it also meant that your income depended on your community being lawless and violent. The fee structure was Byzantine and often led to disputes. You might charge 50 cents for serving a warrant, $1 for making an arrest, and $5 for transporting a prisoner to the county seat. But you only got paid if you successfully completed the service, and you only got paid by whoever was paying for the service, which wasn't always guaranteed. If you arrested someone for a crime, but they didn't have money to pay your fees, and the town didn't have money to pay your fees, and the county didn't have money to pay your fees, then congratulations, you just risked your life for free. The transportation fees were particularly problematic because they required you to travel long distances through dangerous territory while guarding prisoners who had every incentive to escape or kill you. You might spend a week riding to the nearest courthouse, camping outdoors, feeding yourself and your prisoner, and dealing with weather-wild animals and hostile individuals, all for a $5 fee that might or might not actually get paid when you arrived. Many sheriffs supplemented their income through side businesses, which created additional conflicts of interest. Some sheriffs owned saloons, which meant they were responsible for keeping order in establishments that they also owned and profited from. Other sheriffs worked as private security for local businesses, which meant they might have divided loyalties when those businesses came into conflict with other community members. The equipment costs came out of your own pocket, which was another significant financial burden. You had to provide your own guns, ammunition, handcuffs, and any other law enforcement equipment you needed. If your gun broke, you bought a new one. If you ran out of ammunition, you bought more. If you needed a horse to chase criminals, you bought or rented the horse. The town might reimburse you for some of these expenses, but reimbursement was never guaranteed and often took months or years to process. Your office space was sometimes provided by the town, but just as often you had to rent or build your own jail and office facilities. Some sheriffs operated out of their own homes, which had the advantage of saving rent, but the disadvantage of making your family targets for anyone who had a grudge against you. Other sheriffs rented space in existing buildings, which meant they were essentially paying for the privilege of doing one of the most dangerous jobs in America. The pension and retirement benefits were non-existent because the assumption was that you wouldn't live long enough to retire. If you were lucky enough to survive your term as sheriff, you'd move on to some other job and hope that your reputation didn't follow you. If you were unlucky, your family would get whatever money was in your pockets when you died, minus the cost of burying you. Medical care was your own responsibility, which was problematic given that your job involved regular exposure to violence. If you got shot, you paid for the doctor. If you got stabbed, you paid for the stitches. If you got beaten up, you paid for whatever treatment was available. Workers' compensation didn't exist, disability insurance wasn't available, and health insurance was a concept that wouldn't be invented for another 50 years. The result was a job that combined maximum danger with minimum compensation, guaranteed stress, with uncertain rewards, and the responsibility for everyone else's safety while having no guarantee of your own. It was like being asked to be the captain of a sinking ship while being paid in wooden nickels and told to provide your own life preserver. Here's where the job of frontier sheriff gets really interesting. You were expected to enforce laws that didn't exist, maintain order in communities that thrived on chaos, and provide justice in places where justice was whatever you said it was on any given day. It was like being asked to referee a boxing match where the rules changed every round and half the spectators were actively trying to kill you. The legal framework in most frontier territories was, to put it charitably, a work in progress. Territorial governments would pass general laws that were supposed to apply everywhere, but these laws were often written by people who had never been west of the Mississippi River and had no understanding of frontier conditions. The laws might prohibit murder and theft, which sounds reasonable, but they didn't address questions like, what do you do when the nearest courthouse is 200 miles away? How do you conduct a trial when most of the potential witnesses are either dead, drunk, or have fled the territory? What constitutes evidence when there are no forensic investigators and most crimes happen with no reliable witnesses? Federal law technically applied in the territories, but federal law enforcement was virtually non-existent in most places. US Marshals covered enormous territories and might visit your town once a year if you were lucky. They dealt with major federal crimes like mail robbery and interstate criminal activity, but they didn't have time or resources to handle the day-to-day violence and disorder that made up most of a frontier sheriff's workload. Local law was whatever the community decided it was, which meant it could change depending on who was making the decisions and what their interests were. The same action might be perfectly legal on Monday and punishable by death on Tuesday, depending on who was upset about it and how much political influence they had. If the town's most important businessman was involved in gambling, then gambling was legal. If the preacher's wife was leading a temperance campaign, then alcohol might suddenly become prohibited. The enforcement mechanisms were equally improvised. You might arrest someone for a crime, but then what? If there was a jail, it might be anything from a purpose-built structure to a converted storage shed with bars on the windows. Some towns had no jail at all, which meant you had to either release the prisoner immediately, shoot them, or chain them to a tree and hope they didn't escape while you figured out what to do next. Trials were exercises in creative jurisprudence. Some towns had actual judges who traveled circuit and held court when they happened to be in the area. Other towns elected local residents to serve as judges, regardless of their legal knowledge or qualifications. The judge might be the town's most educated resident, which could mean anything from a former lawyer to someone who could read and write and was trusted not to steal the court's money. Juries were selected from whatever local residents were available, sober and willing to serve. This meant that the same people who patronized the saloon with the defendant might be asked to judge whether the defendant was guilty of disturbing the peace at that same saloon. Conflict of interest wasn't a legal concept anyone worried about much. The punishment system was equally flexible. Some crimes were punished by fines, which worked if the criminal had money. Other crimes were punished by physical punishment, which worked if you had someone willing to administer it, and the criminal was willing to submit to it. Serious crimes might be punished by banishment, which worked if the criminal was actually willing to leave and stay away. The death penalty was reserved for the most serious crimes, but determining what constituted a capital offense varied widely from place to place. Murder was usually a hanging offense, but what constituted murder could be interpreted broadly. Horse theft was often a capital crime, not because horses were particularly valuable, but because stealing someone's horse in the desert was essentially condemning them to death. Rape was sometimes a capital offense, but the definition of rape and the standards of evidence were inconsistent. You, as sheriff, were often expected to serve as investigator, prosecutor, judge, and executioner all rolled into one. If someone was killed, you investigated the crime by asking around and seeing what people told you. You decided whether there was enough evidence to make an arrest. You might participate in the trial by presenting evidence and testimony, and if the defendant was sentenced to death, you might be the one expected to carry out the execution. This concentration of power in one person created obvious opportunities for abuse. and those opportunities were frequently taken advantage of. Some sheriffs became essentially dictators in their communities, using their law enforcement authority to settle personal scores, eliminate business competition, or simply terrorize people they didn't like. Other sheriffs tried to be fair and impartial, but found themselves overwhelmed by the complexity of trying to provide justice without adequate legal framework, resources, or support. The result was a legal system that was simultaneously too harsh and too lenient, too arbitrary and too rigid, too violent and too ineffective. Justice was whatever you could make stick. Law was whatever you could enforce. And order was whatever you could impose through fear, respect, or sheer exhaustion. Being a frontier sheriff meant that virtually everyone in your community was either actively trying to kill you, passively hoping someone else would kill you, or at best, completely indifferent to whether you lived or died. It was like being the hall monitor in a school where all the students were armed, and most of the teachers were criminals. Let's start with the obvious enemies, the criminals you were supposed to arrest. These weren't petty thieves and pickpockets. They were men who had killed for money, who robbed banks for a living, who settled disputes with gunfights, and who viewed law enforcement officers as occupational hazards to be eliminated. They had every incentive to kill you before you could arrest them, and they had the skills and weapons to do it. But the criminals weren't your only enemies. The people who employed the criminals, saloon owners, brothel operators, gambling house proprietors, and various other businessmen who profited from illegal activities, also had strong incentives to see you removed from office permanently if necessary. These were often the wealthiest and most politically connected people in town, which meant they could make your life miserable in ways that went far beyond simple violence. Then there were the customers of illegal businesses, which in many frontier towns included most of the adult male population. If you tried to crack down on gambling, you'd anger everyone who enjoyed playing cards for money. If you tried to enforce prohibition laws, you'd anger everyone who enjoyed drinking. If you tried to shut down brothels, you'd anger everyone who enjoyed the services provided therein. Enforcing almost any law meant making enemies of people who just wanted to be left alone to enjoy their vices in peace. The legal system itself often worked against you. Lawyers, when they existed, made their money by defending criminals and finding loopholes in the law. They had financial incentives to undermine your authority and make your job as difficult as possible. Judges were often corrupt or incompetent, and juries could be intimidated, bribed, or simply sympathetic to defendants who shared their background and values. Local politicians frequently viewed sheriffs as threats to their own power and authority. Town councils, mayors, and territorial officials wanted to maintain control over law enforcement and often resented sheriffs who tried to act independently. They might undermine your authority by refusing to fund your office, appointing your enemies as deputies, or simply spreading rumors about your competence or honesty. Even the supposedly law-abiding citizens often resented your authority and looked for opportunities to undermine you. Businessmen might support law and order in principle, but they opposed any enforcement that interfered with their profits. Religious leaders might preach about justice and righteousness, but they often opposed harsh penalties for crimes committed by members of their congregations. Ordinary residents might want protection from criminals, but they also wanted the freedom to carry weapons, drink alcohol, gamble, and generally do whatever they pleased without interference from government officials. Your own deputies could be among your most dangerous enemies. They might be secretly working for criminals, skimming money from arrests and fines, or simply waiting for an opportunity to eliminate you and take over your position. Even honest deputies might resent your authority or disagree with your methods, creating internal conflicts that could get you killed if they became public. Family members of people you arrested or killed would often seek revenge against you and your family. If you shot someone in a gunfight, their brothers, cousins, and friends might spend years plotting to kill you in return. If you arrested someone for a crime, their relatives might harass your family, vandalize your property, or spread lies about you in an effort to drive you out of office. Ethnic and racial tensions created additional enemies. If you were white and tried to enforce laws fairly against white criminals, you'd be accused of favoring minorities. If you were white and tried to protect minority residents from white violence, you'd be accused of betraying your own race. If you were a minority yourself, you'd face constant challenges to your authority and regular attempts to undermine your credibility. Economic interests frequently put you in impossible situations where any action you took would create powerful enemies. If cattle ranchers and farmers came into conflict over land use, water rights, or property boundaries, you'd have to choose sides, and whichever side you chose would become your enemy. If employers and workers had labor disputes, enforcing the law would require you to take actions that would anger one side or the other. Political affiliations created additional complications. If you were perceived as supporting one political party over another, members of the opposing party would work to defeat you in the next election, or simply drive you out of office through harassment and intimidation. In territories where Democrats and Republicans were roughly equally represented, staying neutral was almost impossible, and taking sides was dangerous. The result was a job where your success at enforcing the law was measured by the number of enemies you accumulated. An effective sheriff was someone who had managed to anger virtually everyone in the community while somehow staying alive long enough to continue doing the job. It was a position that required you to be simultaneously beloved and hated, respected and feared, trusted and suspected by different segments of the population. This social isolation was one of the most difficult aspects of the job. You couldn't have normal friendships or business relationships because anyone you associated with might be accused of receiving special treatment. You couldn't participate in normal community activities because your presence might remind people of their grievances against law enforcement. You lived in a constant state of social and political siege, surrounded by people who might smile at you during the day and plot to kill you at night. Let's address the elephant in the room. Frontier sheriffs were often corrupt, not because they were inherently evil people, but because corruption was often the only way to survive in the job. The system was so broken, the pay was so inadequate, and the dangers were so extreme that playing by the rules was essentially a form of suicide. Honest sheriffs didn't just risk their lives, they risked their families' lives, their financial ruin, and their complete social isolation. The most common form of corruption was selective enforcement, which sounds like a polite way of saying taking bribes, because that's essentially what it was. You'd receive payments from saloon owners, brothel operators, gambling house proprietors, and other businessmen in exchange for looking the other way when they violated various laws. This wasn't necessarily a formal arrangement. It might be as simple as receiving regular gifts of money, meals, drinks, or other services in exchange for being less aggressive about enforcement in certain areas. This type of corruption had a certain practical logic to it. Many of the laws you were supposed to enforce were unpopular, unenforceable, or actively harmful to the community's economic well-being. Prohibition laws in communities where everyone drank alcohol were essentially unenforceable unless you wanted to arrest the entire adult population. Gambling laws in communities where gambling was the primary form of entertainment were similarly problematic. Anti-prostitution laws in communities where prostitution was one of the few economic opportunities for women created social problems that were worse than the crimes themselves. Selective enforcement also provided a way to manage limited resources. If you only had time and energy to focus on some crimes, it made sense to focus on the crimes that actually caused harm to the community rather than crimes that existed only on paper. Murder, armed robbery, and horse theft caused real damage and needed to be addressed aggressively. Card playing, drinking, and consensual adult activities were victimless crimes that diverted resources from more serious law enforcement priorities. Another common form of corruption was protection schemes, where you would guarantee the safety of certain businesses or individuals in exchange for regular payments. This was often a reasonable arrangement for everyone involved. The business owners got reliable protection from criminals and competitors. You got a steady source of income that supplemented your inadequate official salary. The community got a form of private security that was more effective than relying on official law enforcement alone. Some sheriffs went into business for themselves, using their law enforcement authority to eliminate competition and protect their own commercial interests. If you owned a saloon, you could use your position to harass competing saloons, delay their license applications, or find excuses to arrest their customers and employees. If you owned a gambling establishment, you could crack down on illegal gambling while ignoring the illegal activities at your own establishment. The line between legitimate business activities and corruption was often blurry. Many sheriffs owned property, invested in local businesses, or provided security services during their off hours. These activities weren't necessarily corrupt, but they created conflicts of interest and opportunities for abuse. If you owned property in the commercial district, you had financial incentives to keep that area safe and prosperous, which might mean neglecting law enforcement in other parts of town. Information was another valuable commodity that could be bought and sold. As sheriff, you had access to information about planned law enforcement activities, pending arrests, and criminal investigations. This information was valuable to criminals who wanted to avoid arrest, businesses that wanted to avoid raids, and politicians who wanted to avoid scandal. Selling this information, or simply failing to act on it in a timely manner, could provide significant supplementary income. Political corruption was almost inevitable given the political nature of most sheriff positions. If you were elected, you owed favors to the people who supported your campaign. If you were appointed, you owed favors to the people who recommended you for the position. These favors might involve selective enforcement, preferential treatment, or simply keeping certain information confidential. The federal government's absence from most frontier law enforcement created additional opportunities for corruption. U.S. Marshals and other federal officials rarely visited most frontier towns, and when they did visit, they relied heavily on local sheriffs for information and assistance. This gave local sheriffs significant control over what federal officials knew about local conditions and criminal activities. Some sheriffs worked directly with criminals, either as silent partners in criminal enterprises or as sources of information and protection. This was obviously dangerous, but it could also be profitable and provided a form of job security. If you were working with the local outlaw gang, they had strong incentives to keep you alive and in office. If you were working against them, they had strong incentives to kill you and replace you with someone more cooperative. The justification for corruption was often self-preservation rather than greed. Honest sheriffs frequently ended up dead, broke, or both. Corrupt sheriffs might be morally compromised, but they were often more effective at actually keeping communities safe and prosperous. A corrupt sheriff who kept the peace and protected local businesses was often more valuable to a community than an honest sheriff who got himself killed trying to enforce unpopular laws. The community often preferred corrupt sheriffs to honest ones, as long as the corruption was reasonable and didn't interfere with essential services. A sheriff who took bribes to ignore gambling and drinking was acceptable. A sheriff who took bribes to ignore murder and robbery was not. The key was finding the right balance between corruption and effectiveness, between self-interest and community service. This moral flexibility extended to other aspects of frontier life. Business owners were often corrupt in their dealings with each other, with their employees, and with government officials. Politicians were routinely corrupt in their use of public funds, their awarding of contracts, and their enforcement of regulations. Citizens were often corrupt in their payment of taxes, their compliance with laws, and their testimony in legal proceedings. The result was a system where corruption wasn't an aberration, it was the normal way of doing business. Sheriffs who refused to participate in this system weren't seen as virtuous. They were seen as naive, unrealistic, and potentially dangerous to community stability and prosperity. Being a frontier sheriff didn't just put your own life at risk. It turned your entire family into targets for anyone who had a grievance against law enforcement. Your wife, children, parents, and siblings all became potential victims of people who wanted to hurt you, but couldn't get close enough to do it directly. It was like having a job where your work followed you home every night and threatened everyone you cared about. The threats against sheriffs' families weren't subtle or implied. They were often explicit and detailed. Criminals and their associates would make it clear that if you arrested them or interfered with their activities, they would retaliate against your family members. These weren't empty threats. Family members of law enforcement officers were regularly kidnapped, assaulted, murdered, or driven out of town by people seeking revenge against sheriffs. Your wife faced particular dangers because she was the most accessible target, and because attacking her would cause you maximum emotional pain. Some sheriffs' wives were threatened with rape or murder as a way of pressuring their husbands to resign or avoid certain law enforcement activities. Others were subjected to constant harassment, vandalism of their property, and social ostracism from community members who opposed their husbands' work. Children of sheriffs were especially vulnerable because they couldn't protect themselves and because they often didn't understand the dangers they faced. They might be threatened or attacked on their way to school, excluded from social activities, or bullied by other children whose parents had been arrested by their father. Some sheriff's children were kidnapped and held for ransom or killed as a way of punishing their parents for law enforcement activities. The isolation that came with being a sheriff's family was almost as dangerous as the direct threats. Other families often avoided socializing with law enforcement families because they didn't want to be seen as taking sides in community conflicts. This meant that sheriff's families had fewer friends, fewer social connections, and fewer people they could turn to for help when they needed it. Economic retaliation was another common way of pressuring sheriff's families. If you owned a business, customers might boycott it in protest of your law enforcement activities. If your wife worked, she might be fired or harassed by her employer. If your children needed jobs, they might find themselves unemployable because of their connection to you. This economic pressure could force families into poverty, even if the sheriff himself was earning adequate income. Housing was a constant security concern because everyone knew where you lived. Your family home was a target for arson, vandalism, and break-ins by people who wanted to intimidate you or search for information about your law enforcement activities. Some sheriff's families moved frequently to avoid these problems, but moving was expensive and disruptive, especially for children who needed stability and education. Education was another challenge for sheriff's families. Children might be excluded from schools, harassed by teachers who opposed their father's work, or threatened by other students. Some families had to send their children to schools in other communities, which was expensive and meant the children couldn't live at home. Other families had to homeschool their children, which required skills and time that many sheriff's wives didn't have. Medical care could be problematic for sheriff's families because doctors might refuse to treat them, provide substandard care, or charge higher fees because of their connection to law enforcement. This was particularly dangerous in medical emergencies, where delays in treatment could be fatal. Religious participation was often difficult for sheriff's families because churches were community institutions where political and social tensions were openly expressed. Preachers might condemn law enforcement activities from the pulpit. Congregation members might shun sheriff's families, and religious events might become uncomfortable or dangerous environments. Some sheriff's families dealt with these pressures by leaving the territory entirely, moving to places where the sheriff's reputation and enemies couldn't follow them. This meant that sheriffs had to choose between their careers and their family's safety, which was an impossible choice for most men. Other families tried to maintain low profiles, avoiding public activities and social engagements that might remind people of their connection to law enforcement. This strategy worked sometimes, but it also meant living in constant fear and isolation. Some sheriff's wives became armed and trained to defend themselves and their children. This was practical, but also dangerous, because it meant that conflicts with criminals could escalate into gun battles that involved the entire family. Children learned to shoot and to watch for potential threats, which was useful for survival, but terrible for their psychological development. The psychological impact on family members was severe and long-lasting. Sheriff's wives often developed anxiety, depression, and other mental health problems from living under constant threat. Children grew up expecting violence and betrayal, which affected their ability to form normal relationships and trust other people. Some family members developed alcohol or drug problems as a way of coping with the stress and fear. Family relationships were strained by the constant pressure and danger. Marriages might end in divorce because the wife couldn't handle the stress or because the husband was never home and always preoccupied with work. Children might resent their father for putting the family in danger or for being absent during important events because of law enforcement duties. Some sheriffs' families developed their own support networks with other law enforcement families, but these networks were limited because there weren't many law enforcement families, and they were often geographically scattered. Corresponding by mail provided some emotional support, but it couldn't replace face-to-face social interactions and practical assistance. The long-term consequences for sheriffs' families were often severe, even after the sheriff left office or moved to a different location. The family's reputation might follow them and affect their economic opportunities, social relationships, and personal safety. Some families changed their names and invented new personal histories to escape their connection to frontier law enforcement. The irony was that sheriffs were supposed to protect their community's families, but they often couldn't protect their own families. The job required them to make enemies of dangerous people, and those enemies naturally targeted the sheriff's most vulnerable and precious possessions, his wife and children. It was a career that demanded men sacrifice their family's safety and happiness for the theoretical benefit of strangers who often didn't appreciate the sacrifice. Tonight, we've journeyed through one of the most mythologized periods in American history and discovered that the reality was far more complex, contradictory, and morally ambiguous than the stories we tell ourselves about frontier heroism and justice. The life of a Wild West sheriff wasn't a romantic adventure. It was a desperate struggle for survival in communities where the normal rules of civilized society had temporarily broken down. What we've learned about frontier law enforcement reveals important truths about the relationship between justice and power, between individual heroism and institutional authority, and between the myths we create about our past and the realities we must confront in our present. The sheriffs of the American frontier weren't heroes in the traditional sense. They were men who found themselves in impossible situations and did what they thought necessary to survive. They operated in a world where moral clarity was rare, where legal authority was weak or non-existent, and where violence was often the only available solution to complex social and economic problems. Their successes and failures tell us as much about the limitations of individual action as they do about the possibilities of personal courage. The corruption that characterized much frontier law enforcement wasn't simply a product of weak moral character. It was a rational response to systemic problems that made honest law enforcement nearly impossible. When legal institutions are inadequate, when compensation is insufficient, and when community support is uncertain, corruption becomes a survival strategy rather than a moral failing. Understanding this helps us evaluate contemporary law enforcement challenges with greater nuance and less moral certainty. The violence that defined frontier justice wasn't an unfortunate side effect of heroic law enforcement. It was the central mechanism through which social order was maintained. Sheriffs like Wyatt Earp didn't succeed because they were morally superior to their opponents, but because they were more effective at using violence and intimidation to achieve their objectives. This uncomfortable truth challenges romantic notions about the role of violence in creating American civilization. The transition from frontier justice to institutional law enforcement represents one of the most important developments in American legal history. But it wasn't simply a progress from chaos to order. Institutional law enforcement brought its own forms of injustice, corruption, and oppression. The professionalization of police work solved some problems while creating others, and many of the tensions between individual and institutional approaches to justice continue to influence American law enforcement today. The mythologization of figures like Wyatt Earp serves important cultural and psychological functions, but it also obscures important historical lessons about the nature of justice, power, and social change. When we transform complex historical figures into simple moral symbols, we lose the opportunity to learn from their actual experiences and to understand the real challenges they faced. The frontier sheriff's experience reminds us that justice is not an abstract moral principle, but a practical social arrangement that must be constantly created and maintained through human institutions. The men who wore badges in frontier communities weren't implementing eternal moral laws. They were improvising solutions to immediate problems with whatever resources and authority they could assemble. Their successes and failures were products of specific historical circumstances that created particular opportunities and constraints. Contemporary debates about law enforcement, criminal justice, and community safety might benefit from the historical perspective that frontier law enforcement provides. The challenges that faced frontier sheriffs, inadequate resources, unclear legal authority, hostile communities, and complex moral dilemmas continue to face law enforcement officers today, though in different forms and contexts. The frontier sheriff's family situation also provides sobering perspective on the personal costs of law enforcement careers. The men who chose to pin on badges in frontier communities weren't just risking their own lives. They were exposing their families to dangers and hardships that often persisted long after their law enforcement careers ended. This personal dimension of law enforcement work is often overlooked in policy debates that focus primarily on institutional and procedural issues. Perhaps most importantly, the story of frontier law enforcement reminds us that the institutions we take for granted in contemporary society, professional police forces, functioning court systems, effective correctional facilities, are relatively recent historical developments that required decades of trial and error, political conflict, and social struggle to establish. These institutions are not natural or inevitable features of civilized society, but human creations that must be constantly maintained and reformed. The American frontier was not tamed by heroic individuals who brought civilization to savage wilderness. It was transformed by economic development, technological change, demographic shifts, and institutional evolution that made frontier conditions obsolete. The sheriffs who operated during the frontier era were symptoms of social and legal breakdown rather than causes of social and legal progress. But this doesn't diminish the significance of their experiences or the lessons we can learn from studying their lives. The frontier sheriffs were ordinary men who found themselves in extraordinary circumstances and who responded to those circumstances with whatever courage, creativity, and moral compromise they could manage. Their stories remind us that history is made by flawed human beings operating under difficult conditions rather than by mythical heroes implementing eternal moral principles. As we face our own challenges with law enforcement, criminal justice, and community safety, we might benefit from the hard-won wisdom of men who learned through bitter experience that justice is not a destination, but a journey, that law enforcement is not a solution, but a process, and that the badge represents not moral authority, but human responsibility. The next time you watch a Western movie or read a story about frontier heroes, remember the real sheriffs who lived and died in frontier communities, men who faced impossible choices, made moral compromises, and struggled to create order in chaotic circumstances. Their true stories are more complex and more instructive than the myths we've created about them, and perhaps in understanding their struggles, we can better understand our own. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the reality behind the mythology of frontier law enforcement. If you found this exploration worthwhile, please consider subscribing and sharing your thoughts in the comments. Until our next adventure into the darker corners of American history, remember that the truth is often more fascinating than the fiction, even when it's less comforting. The badge may have represented hope for justice, but for the men who wore it, it too often represented a one-way ticket to an early grave.